The Google homepage, we all know. When Marissa Mayer showed up to interview at Google, she asked Larry Page if he was into some kind of Zen design aesthetic, looking at this sort of very simple Google homepage. He said, no, that was the only amount of HTML I knew allowed me to code that, creating what we now know to be the design language of Google. Twitter, of course, we all know. Would Twitter be as big as it is today if it had asked us to use 14,000 characters instead of just 140? Microblogging platform transformed the way we communicate, driven by that constraint. And the table on the right of this slide is from IKEA. The founder of IKEA, Ingvar Kamprad, is legendary inside the company for setting impossible challenges for his team. He asked them to make a table for €5. Price being the largest constraint that IKEA is constantly having to deal with as it tries to meet its ambition to provide a better life for the many. So it's legendary inside IKEA to set impossible briefs, to set these difficult constraints. So the constraints actually are the things that make the outcome better. This should be reasonably familiar to us, but yet most of us, when confronted with a constraint, client walks in with a very challenging brief, I want you to do it in half the time, with less money, most of us will react, I would react, as a victim. Really? Can that be done? You're probably already thinking of your own examples of situations where the constraint has actually been quite transformational in your process. Despite that long history from arts and music and business, we always tend to react as in the victim mentality. So we wanted to figure out what was it that united all of these different cases that we were uncovering in our own work, working with challenger brands, and understand, was there a method, were there similar principles in practice here that we could all apply? And so we talked to creative legends like Michael Beirut and Yves Behar, up on the top left there. That's Pierre Luigi Sigismondi, who runs supply chain for Unilever. We talked to teachers in the charter school system in Oakland, dealing with considerable constraints of resource, but still transforming their world, and so on and so forth, to try to uncover some principles. And the book will lead with this kind of key graphic, which talks about the 6 stages of mindset, method, and motivation that seem to be in play in all of these different case studies. It's not a foolproof methodology, that was silly to suggest such a thing, but there's just enough method there that we can potentially all learn from. And my hope in addressing a room full of strategists and planners is that you'll intuitively feel quite close to this, because we all know, and we've all been trained in this notion of the freedom of a tight brief. One of the fundamental roles of planners is this synthesis idea, the synthesis of take all this information, make it into a compact, single-minded brief that's going to electrify the world, that's going to ignite creativity for us. So it's close in to how we've historically thought as planners, and the suggestion here is that we need to take that idea broader than that into the business world. And the trick, the first kind of idea in the book that's so central to this is the notion of propelling questions. So we've been challenged to ask better questions, be more strategic. I'm going to give you one potential way to think about this, which is the notion of propelling questions. So a propelling question is a combination, counterintuitively, of even bigger ambition coupled to that constraint. So when you're faced with a constraint, whether it's a foundational premise of this business, don't use models in the ads, whether it's about resource, how much money you have, method, I want you to do it, but don't do it any other way that we've done it historically, and do it in half the time. The counterintuitive thing to do, but the thing that seems to force us onto new paths, to abandon our path dependence, is to couple that same constraint to a bigger ambition, to make it even harder. And in doing that, preventing us from using anything conventional that is in our current day-to-day. And when, I think Lisa talked about, in our day-to-day, there's so much coming at us that we get very on autopilot, or we use the tried and true because we're trying to be efficient, get a lot of stuff done. And I understand that, and that is absolutely valid for most of the work that we do. But periodically trying to break our path dependence by finding constraints, coupling them to bigger ambitions, is going to be the thing that drives us towards breakthrough. So the aim of the book, and the aim to some degree of this speech, is to give you that sense that when you're confronted with a constraint, rather than thinking that that's going to be too challenging, we need to diminish and reduce our ambitions, is there a way to couple it to a larger ambition and give yourself this transformer mindset? Paul Polman of Unilever, when he got the job as CEO 5 years ago, essentially set his business a propelling question. He said, we are going to double our business by 2020, but we're going to do it by halving our impact. So they know that they need to grow the business. This is how CEOs, marketers keep their jobs. He knows that he needs to be seen as money when he walks in front of his investors. But at the same time, he also knows what's happening in the modern world. We live in a resource-constrained era, and if this company doesn't figure out how to halve its impact, there is no future for it to grow its business. So very challenging, and that set off a root and branch re-examination of every assumption within Unilever, particularly in the supply chain. So I'm going to give you one story about tomatoes, just to illustrate the power of path dependence to keep us locked into the typical way that we solve problems. So Unilever, they want to figure out how to reduce impact and reduce wastage in tomato business. So they start examining every assumption in their business around the tomato business, one of which is the Unilever standard is 5% green tomatoes in every tomato-based product. Somebody says, why 5%? What if it was 10%? I don't know is the response. It's always been 5%. It's in the standard. It's in the pro forma. Can we try what it looks like, what it tastes like if we go to 10%? So they reformulated some products, did some testing with the consumer. Nobody notices the difference. Unilever changed its standard and reduced tomato waste in their system by 27%, which is great for their bottom line, and it's great for the farmers in terms of how much money they can make, increasing their own yield and their own profitability. So challenging a very simple assumption allowed them to completely transform the tomato supply chain. Here's another example of a business that is actually making this approach of looking for the opportunities in constraints a systemic part of the way they approach their business, Nike. So this is a story from the early 90s. When I came out to the States, I was going to work on the Nike brand at Wieden & Kennedy, and the first issue that we confronted was Global Exchange, a non-profit, deciding it was going to make Nike the poster child for poor labor practices, sweatshop labor, Nike bad. And Nike's initial reaction was as the victim. How dare they? We're not here to save the world, we're here to make athletes go faster. Complete denial of their responsibility in that situation. Slowly but surely, as the heat built, they decided they had to tackle this. And one of the ways to kind of try to neutralize the issue was to police it. So in every one of the 200 and something factories where Nike shoes get made, in quite toxic environment, because the solvents are, at that time, were toxic, they needed to ensure that the workers there were wearing face masks. So that was the conventional thinking. Path-dependent thinking said, well, you police the factories. We make sure there's a Nike person there or an ombudsman to watch and fix this problem. It was being possible. They just couldn't be there all the time. So Hannah Jones, at that time, the VP of Corporate Responsibility, showed up at these factories and observed the situation and said, we're not asking the right question. The question we need to be asking is not how do you police the situation, but how do we make a glue that's non-toxic? That's the kind of lateral leap that I think this room, as planners, is quite good at. So if we can engage in those kinds of conversations, reframe the problems, give clients a new glimpse into how to potentially transform their business, we'll be in good shape for this future that right now we may be feeling not such great shape given what we heard this morning. But a fantastic opportunity, and that made a better running shoe. This is the punchline to that story, is that Nike's had now a series of these situations. They were banned from using the original Nike Air. I think it's called sulfur hexafluoride. It's very poisonous. It took the team 8 years to figure out that nitrogen would make for a better airbag, an airbag that actually could be a full foot airbag, and that gave birth to the Air Max 360, the best-selling running shoe of all time. So Nike's now got this confidence that when it identifies constraints in its business, supply chain, design, marketing, that in that constraint is the potential for a transformational idea, not something that should be shrunk from. So we've heard about we're looking for new jobs, we're looking to get upstream, we're looking to add contribution to our clients' businesses, grow their businesses for them, bring them money. How do we do that? We need to ask different questions, we're told. Propelling Questions is my proposal for one tool that you can use to do that. So unreasonable constraints plus bigger ambition equals new opportunities for a brand, for a business, and new opportunities for new kinds of conversations for everybody in this room with their clients. So if we can embrace constraints in that way, then we can begin to ask, when confronted with this really impossible brief that just come one after the next, how can we make this constraint beautiful? Is there a way to see the opportunity in this?